So today's topic is ethical issues, and unfortunately, over time, this has been very minimally covered in research courses. At least as from what my experience in the U.S. Might be different elsewhere, but it's been increasingly, obviously, important as we realize how much the conflict of interest there is, especially in our field, and in multiple authors on papers. Increasingly, I've seen 13 authors, and sometimes more than that on published papers. Anyway, so we'll move along and we'll see if we have questions or other comments from our team. Next slide, please, Jessica. So these are the deadly sins in addiction publishing, and I wanted to remind you that there's at least 2, if not 3, really good chapters on this in the text that we've been talking about over and over again, publishing addiction science. Carelessness are really kind of inexcusable. And we'll talk more about some of these things as we go along. There's some more detailed slides up ahead. Redundant publication, something's been published before, republishing it or large parts of it. Unfair authorship, not giving credit where credit is due or giving credit to people with minimal participation. Undeclared conflict of interest. If you receive money from the tobacco industry, alcohol industry, or from the gambling industry, for example, those are the very common and ones, but there are lots of different types of conflict of interest, and we'll talk about that. Human or animal ethical violations, and we know there's been some history of that in the U.S. Plagiarism, taking large parts of other people's work and publishing it as your own without giving them credit, whether it's direct citation, referencing them, or getting permission to use the other people's work. And then there are other sorts of fraud as well that we may discuss. Next slide, please. In our journal, the Journal of Addictions Nursing, we include policies around ethical issues in our guide for authors, and most journals do. One journal that I looked at, the Alcoholism Journal, they actually list they have policy statements in their author guidelines with a list. Some journals kind of weave some of their policy statements within their authors. Journals ask for an authorship statement, a declaration of substantive contributions signed by all authors. That's pretty common now. It was not that way in the past. But now we want to know what is the specific contribution of each of the authors listed. If a journal has, if a manuscript that's submitted has 13 or 15 authors, you sometimes wonder what was each of these persons' contributions to this paper. A specific conflict of interest statement, a declaration of real and apparent conflicts of interest in language comprehensible to average readers, and this has to be signed by all the authors. And most publishers now have a conflict of interest statement that editors use for their publications, and it's signed and when someone submits a manuscript to the journal publishing page, then they have, as part of their submission, they have to sign a declaration. Each of the authors has to sign that. Human and animal subject statement. It's required for most journals that that authors include a statement that their study, their research was reviewed by the Ethical Review Committee, Human Subjects Committee, or even an outside ethical committee that's not part of the university. It's not uncommon. We want to avoid duplicate submissions as well. In other words, don't submit it to another journal and then you kind of cast around and submit it to several journals in hopes of somebody accepting it. What if 2 or 3 journals accept it? Then what happens? So that's not acceptable. And people have to declare that they haven't submitted it elsewhere. Next slide, please. Why are ethical issues important? Well, because the public is reading your work, whether it's a university professor, whether it's a scientist, whether it's a member of the public, they depend on you to provide accurate, factual, honest reporting of your research. So, and there's really no watchdog except maybe COPE and your Human Subjects Committee, and perhaps your university, since they need to, if you're with a university, they want to maintain their reputation. It's really, really important that the authors are ethical. So we're putting greater emphasis on this. So it's not uncommon for their, especially minor infractions, often from ignorance. They didn't realize they should cite an idea that came from another source rather than make it their own. Rates of detection are low, especially for these minor infractions. It's really hard for an editor to examine everything. We can put papers through let's see, what Authenticate, for example, to determine whether other large parts of the paper have been lifted from another source. So there are various programs out there that publishers use to make sure that to help the editor make sure that the paper has not been substantially copied from another source or other sources. So compliance review and journal requirements are increasing, as I said. Human subject committees, conflict of interest statements. This is pretty common now with most journals. Next slide, please. So in more detail, as I mentioned, we were going to go into this. The authorship statement, the declaration of substantive contribution, and this may be repetitive in the book Publishing Addiction Science, but an authorship statement and conflict of interest statement are so important. So who's of all these people that are listed? I know sometimes students want to list their professor because their professor was helpful to them, or they have allegiance to the professor, even though the professor may not have contributed much. But if they did substantially contribute, they should be given authorship. Conflict of interest statement, anything real or apparent conflict of interest in language comprehensible to the average reader and signed by all authors are included now in, as I mentioned, in publication sites, submission sites for journals. So declaration that the work has not been published previously in whole or in part. And then also human animal subject statements. This is pretty common. And duplicate submissions, agreeing that the publication, that the work has not been published or has not been considered by publication by another journal. These are key. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by carelessness? A failure to adequately review the literature on a topic. If you act like this is the first time that this has been discussed, or There's been people often say there's nothing written on this topic. When you didn't actually adequately review it and go through the various databases to make sure that you've comprehensively reviewed the literature, the major literature on this topic, and that's not uncommon. A lack of candor or completeness in describing one's research method, and we've discussed that here with a couple of papers helping the authors, and sometimes it's not really carelessness, it's lack of understanding, or sometimes when you're writing and creating your own work, you don't really always see what you're missing. And it's always good to have a colleague or an expert review your paper to see if you've adequately described something like the research methods. Presentation of data that are based on faulty statistical analyses. This is one of the reasons we make sure that, for example, for our journal, we have at least one or two statistical experts in our review panel. Because not all of us are that knowledgeable about stats, especially if there's a very extensive statistical analyses in papers. So and this is not uncommon either, using the wrong analytical stats for various data, especially for your variables. Citation of articles without having read the primary sources. You can't just read the abstract or read somebody else's review of the literature. You really need to get in there and review the literature yourself. There may be errors may have been made in the other reviews. So you want to do that yourself and come up with your own understanding of the literature. Selective citation of only those articles that support a particular point of view. That's not uncommon either. And again, it's a mistake that doesn't necessarily mean the author was careless, but it can be viewed that way by reviewers. So you want to be careful of bias. Selective citation to enhance one's reputation, epitomized by self-citation. There's sometimes pressure from certain journals that one self-cite or cite articles that are published in that journal to increase their impact factor. That's unethical, but it's not uncommon for some journals. We don't do that in the Journal of Addictions Nursing, but some journals do that to enhance their impact factor. Thank you. Next slide, please, Jessica. Unfair authorship. This is pretty uncommon. I mean, pretty common for some some journals see. So as I mentioned, people who may not have had a significant contribution should not receive credit for as an author when they haven't contributed. A co-author, such as a science writer, is not listed because the service is provided by a drug company. So that's inappropriate. And if you do list somebody like that, just make sure that their conflict of interest is noted, so that it's not that we don't want to we want to exclude anybody who has a conflict of interest. We do want to include them, but we want to alert the public that's reading our paper that there may be bias, so that the reader can make an informed decision about how much they will depend on the paper. Some persons are listed as co-author, even though no substantial contribution was made to the article or the research. And that's self-explanatory. Failure to give proper recognition to a person's contribution by listing them lower in the author list than they deserve. Again, that's also self-explanatory. And then award of co-authorship for minor contributions based on personal or political considerations. And also we talked about that briefly, and that's self-explanatory as well. Next slide, please. So COI, that you'll see it abbreviated often, conflict of interest, that's probably one of the key issues around publication. It's defined as a situation or relationship in which professional, personal, or financial considerations could be seen by a fair-minded person as potentially in conflict with independence of judgment. This was developed by the beginnings of ISAJE at the Farmington meeting in Farmington, Connecticut in 1997. Group of addiction researchers got together. You were probably one of them, Richard, and you could probably talk a little bit more about that.
No, that was before my time even.
Wow. Anyway, so they developed these points about conflict of interest. And conflict may be personal, commercial, political, academic, or financial. So it's not always just commercial. It can be varied. They include pet theories, a validation of one's own ideas, achieving publishable results, and gaining recognition for a discovery. So sometimes papers are published by drug companies using science writers that they employ to push a certain drug, for example, or push a certain instrument that they have developed. So you really have to watch that, especially in our field. It's not uncommon for drug companies, the alcohol industry, or even the gambling industry to promote certain ideas, certain drugs, certain ways of thinking. Financial interests may include employment, research funding, stock or shared ownership, payment for lectures or travel, consultancies, and company support for staff. I remember in the 90s, the opioid addiction research companies who developed opioids were gave very lucrative monies to researchers to present data that their drugs were not addicting, or that we had to give all that patients needed if they were in pain, without consideration of other forms of treatment for pain. So conflict of interest is not in itself wrongdoing, as I mentioned, as long as you present the conflicts of interest in your statements of in your paper submissions. Next slide, please. The potential for conflict of interest in the addiction field is enhanced by relationship or funding connected with the tobacco industry, alcohol beverage industry, the gambling industry, the for-profit healthcare systems, private hospitals, pharmaceutical industry, and social aspect organizations that receive their primary support from these sources. So there's lots of problems and potential problems in our area. There are 3 levels of conflict of interest. A real conflict of interest means that the author or the administrative unit from which the author has an employment relationship has a financial or other interest that could actually influence the author's position with respect to the subject matter being considered. An apparent conflict of interest exists when an interest would not be necessarily influence the author, but could result in the author's objectivity being questioned by others. So you do want to, clear yourself with an apparent conflict of interest. A potential conflict of interest exists when a reasonable person might be uncertain as to whether or not an interest should be reported. So these are all important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. As you know, there have been instances in the U.S. that have been reported even somewhat recently. where there's been violation of human and animal subject policies. Ethical review is a necessary requirement for all research now. It should be included in the methods section saying that ethical approval had been obtained from where it was obtained. It just needs to be one sentence at least. And editors look for this in the papers that are submitted to their journals. This is usually a university or, as I mentioned, the health board ethics committee if the individual, the authors are not connected with the university. Next slide, please. Plagiarism, we mentioned this briefly, very, very common, ranges from the unreferenced use of others' published and unpublished ideas to submission under new authorship of a complete paper, sometimes in a different language. It may occur at any stage of planning, research, writing, or publication. It applies to print and electronic versions. It's so difficult when papers are coming to your journal from overseas. You don't always have an understanding of whether it was published in say, their own country or another country. All sources should be disclosed through appropriate citation or quotation conventions. And if a large amount of other people's written or illustrative material is to be used, permission must be sought. It's sometimes difficult to determine what is a large amount. So if you're uncertain or you're concerned about it, you can check with COPE, or you can just go ahead and ask permission from the publisher of the article that you're wanting to quote from. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Let's questions or comments, please. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, I think one of the things that is interesting is that there is quite a lot of unethical behaviour that occurs. I mean, I don't know if that was mentioned in the last slide, but the business about entirely making things up. There was a professor in London at Imperial College who made up data, and his students actually blew the whistle on him, and he was sacked for that. So it's a very serious offence if it's caught. But also the business of self-plagiarism is very easy to cite yourself and not be bothered to rewrite it rather than putting it in a different form of words if you're talking about the same study.
Right. Good point.
I think the other thing about ethical standards is interesting because for those people who did social psychology, as that was my first degree, and we studied some of the social psychology experiments in America in the 60s and 70s, which were fascinating, but you wouldn't be allowed to do them now, like the Stanford Prison Experiment or the Stanley Milgram's work, because it would be seen to be unethical because of the pressure it put on people. So there has been a lot of change. And in our field, it is very difficult to do studies where if you want to compare one treatment with another and you're depriving one group of people of a treatment or an intervention. And I know we had this when we started doing needle exchange in Wales back in the 1980s, 90s. And the Welsh local government said, well, why don't you give needle exchange to one city and not to the other, and then compare the rates of HIV? And we said, you can't do that. That's completely unethical. But they hadn't thought it through, so it can be quite a difficult area to do research in because of some of these ethical issues.
Yeah, another example that you made me think of, Richard, when you were talking was, I was looking when I was doing some work on interactions of men and women in social situations. I looked at a study that had eavesdropped on couples in coffee shops, and I recorded their conversations and the frequency of interruptions or talking over by either sex, and certainly couldn't do that now. Eavesdrop on people's conversations for research purposes without their permission. But that kind of thing was common back in the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment for those of us who are working with students. You know, one of the things that I hear often are that students are very intimidated by going through the institutional review board process. And in our school at this time, we have both a Doctor of Nursing Practice degree as well as the PhD degree. And many students say, oh, I'll do the DNP because then I can do quality improvement and I don't have to go through the IRB. And, you know, the reality is that if you are developing a grant proposal, most of the information that the IRB needs is going to be within your proposal anyways. And their whole purpose is to protect human subjects. And so I really try to instill in students to view the IRB and that whole process as, you know, a friendly relationship, not an antagonistic one. And, you know, when the IRB comes back with a list of 10 points that need to be addressed, you address them and resubmit. So.
Yeah, good point, Ann.
Yeah, I hear that a lot from students.
Yeah.
I think one of the other points is the point that you made, Chris, about unfair authorship. It used to be the case, and I hope it's changed, but I don't think it has entirely, that if you were the head of department, you expected to get your name on every paper, or if you were the professor. And I can remember when I was a very baby psychologist working in a child psychology unit, and I wrote a paper on hyperactivity, which is what's known as ADHD these days. And it was me and the psychologist who did all the work, but the professor of pediatrics demanded that his name was on the paper, you know? And that's very unfair. So in my last job, I mean, I've retired now, but in my last job, I used to take students on placement from university. And if we wrote a paper together, I made them the first author, because to them, it was more important than it was to me. And I think that's one thing that students and junior staff should get their recognition, and we shouldn't just be giving unfair credit to senior authors just because of their, or senior people just because of their role.
I had another, thank you, Richard. I had another unusual situation. I received a paper from a student, and I discovered that it was totally her dissertation, which the paper was from, was totally published and by citation abstracts. They're doing more of that now. So I turned her down, and her professor at the University of Phoenix just really tried to bully me into accepting her paper. I mean, he was pretty aggressive with me, and I just held my ground and got the support of my publisher as well in that. But you might come across something like that.
Yeah,